All right. Hello, I'm Ari Goldstein, Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program with Judy Batalion and Molly Crabapple. We're here to discuss Judy's terrific new book, The Light of Days, the untold story of women resistance fighters in Hitler's ghettos, which was just released on April 6th by William Morrow Publishers. The book, which has already been optioned by Steven Spielberg for a major motion picture, tells the stories of the brave Jewish women who fought back against the Nazis. You can order your copy at the link in the Zoom chat. Judy is a writer, curator, researcher, and lecturer whose first book in 2016 was titled White Walls, a memoir about motherhood, daughterhood, and the mess in between. She was born and raised in Montreal and now lives here in New York, where she also contributes essays to the New York Times and other publications. Molly is an artist and writer who authored Drawing Blood and co-authored Brothers of the Gun, which was longlisted for a National Book Award with Marwan Hisham. She's also an award-winning animator and has pioneered a new genre of live illustrated explainer journalism, collaborating with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Jay-Z, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the ACLU. Molly is also here with us in New York. Feel free to share questions in the Zoom Q&A box anytime during the discussion. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Judy Batalion and Molly Crabapple for a discussion of The Light of Days.
Thank you so much for that amazing introduction, Ari. And thank you so much to the Museum of Jewish Heritage for having us. And thank you especially to Judy for writing this extraordinary book. The Light of Days is a book that's at once this astounding work of scholarship, of resurrecting the forgotten stories of women, some of whom were girls who were barely more than teenagers, who fought back with guns and as smugglers and as couriers against the Nazi occupation of Poland. It's also a profound work of storytelling, something that is written with such vividness that this sort of tragedy and that this sort of courage warrants. And it's something that both as a writer and a scholar, Judy should be commended for in every way. It's a book that made me cry many times, and also a book that made me marvel at how she was able to get this much information and tell stories this beautifully. I have so much that I want to ask Judy about The Light of Days, but for the start, I wanted to ask her about her motivations for writing this book. Why did you decide that these stories of these young female Jewish resistance fighters need to be told?
Well, first of all, let me thank everyone. Thank you, Ari, for the introduction. Thank you to the museum. Thank you, Molly. It's an honor for me to be in conversation with you. You know, I'm a huge fan of your work as well. Why did I write this book? Good question. This book actually began, I can tell you that story. This book began completely by accident. I never set out to write about the Holocaust. I never set out to write about Jewish women in the war at all. It started 14 years ago. I was living in London at the time. I was exploring my Jewish identity. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors from Poland. And I was very interested in what I call the emotional legacy of the Holocaust, the way that trauma passed through generations. And in my own life, I'm a very anxious person. And I was thinking a lot about that. I was thinking about how my Holocaust heritage had really shaped my perception of and reaction to danger. And I was interested in the idea of danger. And so I decided to write, at the time I was doing a lot of performance. I decided to write a performance piece about Jewish women confronting danger. And the first one to come to mind was a woman I'd studied in 5th grade, and her name was Hannah Senesh. And I don't know if you know her, but for those who don't.
I dressed up as Hannah Senesh when I was in 5th grade. I think we all had that book, the one that has the pictures of her, she's in Palestine and then she's in her paratrooper's uniform and she looks so beautiful in this very, very Jewish way that I personally really identified with. And I think all of us, we were Hannah Senesh in 5th grade.
So Hannah Senesh in 5th grade is how this all began.
Oh my God.
I remember thinking, I'm thinking about Hannah Senesh and this image of her, she had moved to Palestine, but then she joined the Allied forces. She became a paratrooper. She went back to fight the Nazis. And she was, maybe you agree, she was the symbol. She became a symbol of kind of Jewish heroics. But I was interested, like, not in Hannah Senesh, the symbol. I was interested in Hannah Senesh, the person. Who does that? Who goes back to Nazi-occupied Europe to fight? What is the psychology? Like, what is a personality that does that? So that's where I decided I wanted to find a more nuanced biography of Hannah Senesh. So I went to the British Library and I looked up Hannah Senesh in the catalog, and there were not very many books about Hannah Senesh at the British Library. So I just ordered whatever they had. And one of the books, when I went to pick up like my stack at the counter, it was an unusual book. It was an older book. It was sort of in this worn blue fabric with gold writing. And it was in Yiddish. It was called Frauen in die Ghettos, Women in the Ghettos. But then I would say even more unusual than the book is the fact that I speak Yiddish. So I was able to read it. So I started flipping through it. I was really mostly interested in it as an artifact because it was quite beautiful and antique. And it was from 1946. So I'm flipping through the book looking for Hannah Senesh, but I can't find her. So she's only like in the last few pages. In front of her, there's 180 pages of bits and pieces of other young Jewish women who had fought the Nazis, with photographs and names and like little bits of bios and snippets. Now my Yiddish was rusty at the time. So I'm like reading over, like, am I getting this right? Because the chapter titles were like weapons, ammunition, partisan battle. And this was both in tone and in content. It was just so different from any Holocaust story I'd ever heard. And that's how it all began. That's how it all began. That was my very long answer.
One of the reasons I think that these stories have not been told before is that Yiddish, which used to be the language of the Jews of Eastern Europe, is now a language only spoken by a few million people, mostly Haredi Jews around the world. So the fact that you not only, studied Yiddish, but that you spoke Yiddish, as a child, like you grew up in this, enabled you to do research that other scholars have not been able to. Can you talk a little bit about like the role of Yiddish, like the importance of Yiddish, and like how, like what are your thoughts on the Yiddish language and what it did for you here?
All right, wir kennen reden wegen Yiddish. I really just
nicht reden in Yiddish.
The rest of the programs? No, it is not. So interestingly, the reason this original book that I found was in Yiddish, so I didn't know this until much later, but that book was an anthology. It was put together specifically, it was actually made up of snippets from Hebrew publications, from publications coming out at the time in Palestine that were about these women and by these women. And it was translated into Yiddish for American Jews. It was turned into Yiddish so that it would be more widespread, so that it would be more broad, so that more Jewish people in the US would know these stories of these heroic Jewish women. So of course, that's not what happened. These stories were really quickly forgotten. You asked me about Yiddish. I mean, I grew up speaking Yiddish in my family. I was raised by my grandmother every day. She cared for me. And so Yiddish was really my first language. It's what I spoke. And then I went to a very unusual school system in Montreal. I grew up in Montreal. And again, only in doing research for this book did I realize that I went to a school system based out of Polish Jewish education philosophies, which is also partly, I think, why I got these stories and why they made sense to me. I didn't even realize I was educated in the same way as many Polish Jews in the 1930s in the socialist secular Judaism. And as part of that education, we studied Yiddish language and literature. We also studied Hebrew language and literature, but it was a non-religious Jewish education. So there was a lot of focus on Yiddish. We had a book called College Yiddish, and I would have to conjugate verbs. And, one day I'd be studying Yiddish, and the next day I'd be studying physics. And who knew Yiddish would become my cash cow? Gay face.
Everyone gets into Yiddish for the easy cash. That's what it is.
So
I want to talk a little bit more about your process in researching this story. So you find this amazing, dusty book about women in the ghetto. But then from there, you flesh out these extraordinarily detailed stories about women like Renya Kukielka or, Vlodka Mir or Vitka Kempner. How did you do, tell me about your research that you did. I want to hear about your process.
So as I said, this started 14 years ago. So it's been a long research process. And the first few years of that were just me translating this Yiddish book. I was very lucky to receive a grant from the Hadassah Brandeis Institute. I think they thought I would do this in 6 months. Like 5 years later, I was like, I have a draft. And they had given up on me, but I kept going with this. It was a very difficult translation. As I said, I was working in the London art world. My Yiddish was rusty. I was not using it all the time. And also emotionally, it took me a very long time to commit to going here full time. This was tremendously difficult memoir and testimony to read. But let me answer your question first about the research process. So after translating the book, it went through many different stages. It was going to be an academic resource. It was going to be an academic translation. It was going to be an annotated translation. I then started writing it as a novel, fictional, combined with my grandmother. It was a totally different project. And throughout all these processes, I ended up doing bits of research on the context and on the places and times. So this sort of story started seeping into me. But it was really only in 2017, after the women's marches started, that I became aware that, wow, I think there might be widespread interest in organized women's resistance. And that's when I started talking about it with my literary agent. And she was the one who really said, this really happened? Young Jewish women are walking around with guns taped to their torsos and shooting Nazis? And I said, yes, this is what I found in this original Yiddish document. And she's like, you have to write this as nonfiction. You owe it to the story. And of course she was right. I was just afraid of going there because I knew how much research I would have to do. And so finally, to answer your question, that was the point where I started going through this Yiddish book and taking all the names that came up and trying to find these women in archives, in museums, in libraries, in any Jewish studies organization. And I ended up finding that many of these little snippets that I had originally been working with came from full-length memoirs, came from long testimonies. Some of these women left dozens of testimonies in different archives. And so the early part of this work was collecting as many first-person accounts as I could and reading them. I mean, I read dozens and dozens and dozens of these accounts. And in each account, each woman would mention 20 other women who she was working with in the underground. And then I would find their stories and their stories. So it really mushroomed. And then I had to condense again.
One thing to me that's very interesting about these stories is that typically when stories are told about war and about fighters, it's typically a man's story. And if there are women's stories, because there are always women fighters and there are always women who are participants, if there are women's stories, they're often told as peripheral, like an add-on. However, that was not true in the story of the Jewish resistance to Nazism. Women were central to the resistance. They were not peripheral in any way. They were in the leadership and they were at every level of it. And also they often did roles that men couldn't do, particularly the role of Courier Girl. Can you speak specifically about what women did and why they were so central in the resistance?
So to work in the resistance in the war, I mean, in Nazi occupied Poland, you had to leave the ghettos. You had to be on the outside. And it was easier for women to be on the outside. Not every role in the resistance meant being on the outside. Ghetto fighters and planners of uprisings could be on the inside. But women, it was easier for women to be on the outside. So they took on those roles. And I'll tell you why it was easier. So to be on the outside, of course, one had to pretend not to be Jewish. Otherwise, you would be killed immediately. Jews were not allowed to be outside the ghetto. So it was easier for women to perform Christianity, to perform as young Catholic girls. this is for several reasons. One of them is because they were not circumcised. So women didn't have a marker on their body of their Jewishness. And for men, if a man was suspected of being a Jew, at gunpoint, he would be told to drop his pants. Women didn't have that threat. They weren't nervous about that. Couldn't happen to them. Moreover, and I got really into the 1930s in Poland in my research. And in 1930s Poland, this is when the people that I write about, the resistors, were being educated. Education was mandatory for boys and girls. But many families chose to send their sons to Jewish schools and their daughters to public school. And because of that, and this was like because it was cheaper tuition and things, but because of that, Jewish women learned Polish custom, Polish habit. They were familiar with Polish, even with prayers, with Catholic prayers, with mannerisms. Look at me here, even on the screen, look at me gesticulating. I'm like watching myself in Zoom. So this was a very Jewish thing to gesticulate. And one of the women writes about how she had to wear a muff when she was going undercover. So it would literally block her hand so she could perform as Polish. So women were much more acculturated. They were more assimilated in 1930s Poland. And very important, they learned to speak Polish, as they say, like a Pole, without the creaky Yiddish accent. So it was much easier for women to pass. And of course, as women, they were trained to, in a sort of global, general, gendered way, to listen to others' cues, to be aware of their environments, to even be coy and flirtatious. And all those things also helped them. They were great skills for going undercover, for being spies. So,
well, one of the, sorry.
No.
One of the things that I loved about your book, and that I think is unfortunately rare in many books about the Holocaust in Poland, is that you spend a lot of time not just speaking about what people suffered during the Holocaust, but the world they lived in beforehand. And one of the things that you do an amazing job evoking is the world of these youth movements, these political youth movements that so many Polish Jewish young people were part of. These political youth movements, they might be, Zionist, they might be Zionist socialist, they might be socialist anti-Zionist, they might be communist, but there was a world of these like tightly knit, movements of young people, often led by young people. And I'm also working on a book right now about the Jewish Labor Bund. And one of the things that I found was that one of the best predictors of whether a young person would be involved in the organized resistance was if they were part of a youth movement. And I want you to talk about the youth movements and what role that played for these young women.
So in Poland, 100,000 Jewish youth were members of youth movements. It was a huge number. And they actually weren't allowed to join the Polish Scouts. So some of the youth movement was a sort of reaction to that. But as you say, these youth movements had different philosophies. They were affiliated with different politics, with different political parties, from religious to completely secular and communist. But these youth movements were central to their lives. They were emotional, intellectual, social, and spiritual training grounds. They taught them, I write mostly about socialist secular youth movements, some Zionists, I have a few Bundists in my story, and they believed in collectivism, equality, self-sufficiency, the pride in acknowledging the truth, pride in your heritage. So these movements were, first of all, they learned to work together. Many times, actually, especially in the Zionist youth movements, the teenagers and people in their early 20s, they left their family home and moved in with their youth movement. This is before the war. There were kibbutzim, or communes, collectives all over Poland. I didn't know that before doing this research. So often they lived on kibbutzim with their comrades. And they made their money together. They were a family. And they were also very interested in psychology, and psychoanalysis, self-reflection. They were very aware of how they collaborated, of what their strengths and weaknesses were. And it is these youth movements that in the ghettos became these resistance cells and eventually guerrilla militias. And I think a lot of it is because of the training to work collectively, to live collectively. They knew each other, they trusted each other, and they were brought up on a diet of pride. And I think all that affected their capacity and power for resistance.
And this is something that I think is so important when we're trying to think about what lessons we can learn today for how to resist fascism or authoritarianism, that these networks of resistance didn't just spring up overnight after the Nazis invaded Europe or after the Nazis invaded Poland. These were things that had been in existence for years and years and years. And these were deep bonds that people had built. And those deep real life bonds that people built together, that those collective bonds are what enable people to fight fascism. It's not something that you can make overnight. You have to build deep bonds with each other to do it before.
In fact, it was hard to join the underground if you hadn't been part of the group before, because they didn't know if they could trust you. They didn't know if you were a collaborator. They didn't know if you were a spy for another group. They just didn't know. So the deep bond is critical. It was really, really very important. Someone who wanted to join had to be rigorously interviewed and assessed to see if they could be admitted into the bond.
One of the things that I really appreciated about this book is that in addition to, telling the larger story of this resistance, it also has these like really deeply sensitively drawn individual portraits. And one woman that you focus on is a young woman named Renya Kukielka. And I want you to talk about her and why you chose her and tell us a little bit about her story.
Sure. So Renya's perhaps one of the central characters of the book. I kind of begin it with her birth and end it with her death. So she forms a skeleton for the story for me. And I was drawn to her immediately. Renya was she was 15 when the war started. She was not political. She was actually a bit young for the youth movements, and she wasn't even interested in that at that time. And in a way, that's what drew me to her, that she was kind of I felt she was relatable to a contemporary audience. And also her writing was not political. Her writing about the war was very narrative and very detailed. We'll come back to that. Let me tell you a bit about her first. So she was 15 when the war started. She was immediately defiant in the ghetto. She used to slip out of the ghetto to trade family heirlooms for food, to barter it, to try to help feed her family. When she knew the ghetto was going to be liquidated, she fled. She lived in forests. She took train. She was once recognized on a train. She got up, walked to the end, and jumped off. She pretended to be Catholic. She looked good, as they used to say. She could pass for a non-Jew. She was lighter toned. So she got a job working as a housemaid for a German family, but she didn't want to be there. She wanted to be with her sister, actually. And her sister was part of the underground in this town, Beijing. So her sister, she connects with her sister. They smuggle her over to Beijing. And they need a courier girl. This is what I didn't answer before. What were the courier girls doing? I didn't get to that. So now I'll tell you. The courier girls were Jewish girls. And I say girls because they were very young. They were teenagers, maybe in their early 20s, who, again, dressed up, often dyeing their hair, changing their outfits, wearing the muff if they need to look like a Polish teenager, Polish young woman. They slipped in and out of the ghettos, and they basically connected the communities of Poland. They connected the ghettos. At first, they were bringing ghettos. Jews weren't allowed to have radios. They weren't allowed to have newspapers. They didn't know what was going on around them. They didn't know even of the genocidal plan of the Nazis. So it was Jewish girls who were bringing this information, who were at first smuggling in illegal books, bulletins, underground newspapers, hope. As they began to learn more about the Nazis' plan, it was these girls who were bringing information about the exterminations, about death camps. Then, as the youth movements became guerrilla fighting units, it was these girls that were arming them, and they were leaving the ghettos. So Renya was 18 at the time when she joined the underground. She would take trips to Warsaw, money in her garter belt, meet a weapons dealer in the cemetery, buy guns from him, tape them to her torso. They were carrying cartridges, explosives, getting on and off of trains. They were bringing fake IDs, Aryan papers. They were also helping to transport Jews. She would take a Jew out of the ghetto, bring her with her on the train, and try to find her a safe spot or a hiding spot in the city, or in some cases, some of the couriers brought Jews out of labor camps and out of ghettos into the forests. So yes, I can go on, as you can tell. I can talk about this forever.
But and in addition to, you know, Courier Girls, you also write about women who physically fought the Nazis, including Zivia Lubetskin, who was the only woman on the high command of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Can you speak a bit about what life was like for a woman who was a partisan fighter? And maybe tell us a bit about Zivia's story as well.
So by partisan fighter, you mean, by partisan, I often use to talk about forest fighters, but do you mean a woman who was like a combat fighter?
Exactly, a woman who picked up a gun and shot it.
So the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which also I'd always heard of, but really knew very little about until I began doing research for this book. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was organized by these youth movements. There were about 750 young Jews. It was a very organized effort, and 250 of them were women. So I'm thinking now about what some of these women were doing. They trained, they learned how to shoot guns. They had so few bullets. In one ghetto, they would practice in a basement, and they made a wall out of mud so that the bullet would go in the wall. They'd be able to reuse it and try again. They had these small fighting units. They had strategy for how to push off the Nazis during the liquidation. And some of them were bombing near the gates. Some of them were rushing to the roofs and throwing explosives from the roofs. They experimented, and they thought a lot about military strategy, and women were just in these training groups with men. And I'm thinking of one example, this woman, Masha Füdermelch. She was a Bundist, and in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, she tells a story that she, climbed up to the roof. She was one of the roof attackers, and her fingers are shaking, and she has to light a match and light the explosive, and she's flinging it out onto the Nazis below her, and they stop and they start yelling in shock, "Eine Frau kämpft, eine Frau kämpft." Like, what's shocking to them is that a woman is fighting, a woman is throwing Molotov cocktails and explosives at their tanks. So yes, I think women were trained in the same way that men were to do combat, guerrilla combat.
One of the other things that I was just in awe of for this book is you talked about how often memoirs are from this time are very, very, very politicized. It's something I've been struggling with myself in my own research. You'll read like a biography of someone, and it'll be, Henrik Ehrlich was the authentic embodiment of the Jewish working classes and their organic struggle. And you're like, no one talks like that. No one has ever spoken like that in the world. And but you, in this book, you have such detail and vividness, including about things that are like, so traumatic for people to have written about, like, being imprisoned or losing their family. And you have so much and such authenticity. How did you get that? Because I'm like, just as a writer, I'm like, I want to learn from you.
So a lot of that was just the people I chose to focus on. And this is, again, I'm like starting to answer questions. I'm coming back to them in later questions. That's a bit how my brain works. So I said to you before that a part of the reason I picked Renya as my central character is because she was not super political in her outlook, and her writing was very matter of fact. It was narrative, and it had detail in it. So this was a treasure for me as a writer. I was able to work with the detail that she left me and then build on that. And for many of these women, the ones that I drew, that I sort of spun their stories into longer, more elaborate tales, is because they had left me testimony with detail. I found 5 or 6 of Renya's testimonies that were scattered in different archives, and I used them to build on top of each other. And then also I'd read many, many testimonies of these same events. So I took details from all over and brought them together to try to create a fuller picture. I also went to Poland, and I went to these places. And like, one thing, you know, what's your point of going to Poland, Judy? Like, yes, I went to some archives and I spoke to some people, but really I got on that train from Warsaw to Krakow because I wanted to see what it looked like when Hella Schupper was carrying bags of guns in fashionable handbags. What was she looking at when that train was going back and forth? It was very important for me as a writer to try to pretend almost to be these characters, to put myself in the position as much as possible. And I think that really helped me create the visual panorama or the scenes in the story. So all those things.
So beautifully written. So as Jews from Eastern Europe, I think that we often feel like we know about the Holocaust, whether or not we've researched it. It's just such a part of our, you know, collective memory. What were things that you discovered in your research that surprised you or that you didn't know?
I mean, I didn't know any of this. Yeah. That's what was so surprising. Like, this whole story I didn't know. But, you know, I was very surprised by the scope of the resistance. I'd heard of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I didn't know that over 90 European ghettos had armed Jewish resistance units. 30,000 Jews joined partisan detachments in the forests. Rescue networks helped over 12,000 Jews in hiding in Warsaw alone. These were much broader scale projects or forms of resistance than I simply hadn't known this at all. I was very surprised, as I was saying before, by 1930s Poland. I had no idea. I felt that part of our history or narrative really became eclipsed, of course, by the horrors that happened after. But what a fascinating time of both feeling of not belonging and this a cultural golden age. You know, Warsaw had 180 Jewish newspapers. It was a flourishing, creative, artistic, literary, intellectual community. And I was very surprised by that too. And then, of course, all these stories of women hiding underground bulletins, you know, braided in their hair and carrying dynamite in their underwear. I could sit here and talk to you for 5 hours about everything that surprised me. It was one of those projects where every day I felt I learned something new that really bowled me over. That's why I can talk so much about it.
So we're getting towards the part where I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience, but I wanted to ask you a final question, which in some ways is obligatory, which is, why are these stories important for us to study now? And what can we learn for them that's not just relevant historically and relevant to understanding our heritage, but also relevant for the world now and how we live today?
And I just think we can be so inspired by these young women who had nothing, who were starving, who really had nothing. Their families had been killed, and they that didn't matter. They went up against the Nazis, against the army. The biggest militaries in the world couldn't defeat the Nazis, and that didn't matter. What mattered was that they worked together and they risked their lives time and time again in their passion and in their fury and in their fight for justice and freedom. And I hope that's the kind of core inspiration that people can take from this story.
That was so beautiful. Thank you. And yes, everyone, if you haven't already, this book is a pretty essential one, so go buy it. I'm going to start going through these questions that are in the chat and let's see. All right. So the first question, which is from Pete, is, where were Judy's grandparents born, and how and where did they survive the war?
So my father's parents actually came to Canada in the earlier 30s. They were also from Poland, Warsaw. And my mother's parents, my mother's mother was born in Puławy, which is sort of between Lublin and Warsaw. And my mother's father was born in Rudźmin, which is almost a suburb of Warsaw. And they were a bit older than the characters in my story. So they were already married when the war began, and they decided to flee east. And they, long story, I won't get into all the details, but they made it across sort of the Russian border, and they were forced into work camps in Siberia. Of the 300,000 Jews that did survive in Poland, 200,000 survived by fleeing east. And yet another very under-discussed story. My grandparents never talked about their experiences in Siberia. That's another book for me to write. But that is how they survived. And my mother was born in 1945 on their way back to Poland, where they lived in Western Poland for a number of years after the war too.
Could you tell us who compiled the Yiddish anthology that began your journey and if it's available anywhere?
Yes, it was compiled by someone named Leib Schwizman. He also escaped Europe, and he actually went to Asia and eventually came to New York. And he was a historian of labor Zionism. And that's why this is part of his project of sort of telling American Jews about the amazing exploits of these labor Zionist women in the war. And is it available? It is available. I believe there is a copy at the Yiddish Book Center at the Center for Jewish History. It's available in most sort of libraries that would hold Yiddish books from the 40s.
So this brings up just a personal question that I had. So in doing my own research, one of the things that I found about the resistance in Poland is that because people who were in the resistance often came from specific political parties or groups, after the war, people were generally interested in telling a story about the resistance that put their group in a dominant role, shall we say, and perhaps marginalize the contributions of other groups. So communists told a story where there were no right-wing Zionists, Bundists told a story where there's no left-wing Zionists, you know, and so very often I would have to read testimonies from like so many different sides just to get any, accurate view of what was going on that wasn't, sort of built on, trying to advance your own party. Did you find this in your research as well?
In Israel right now, there are 3 archives just of different labor Zionist groups. Within the labor Zionists, there are 3 different archives, and they still don't agree with each other. They still have a different take on the war. They still feel that it was misrepresented, and they should. So I absolutely. I felt that. And, they were fighting in the ghettos too. They, part of the project, especially in Warsaw, was bringing the different groups together to create one coherent rebellion. In places like Vilna, they came together more easily. So it depends on the ghetto and on the condition. But yeah, I absolutely found this. And that's part of why I read so many memoirs and testimonies, also to try to get some balanced view that wasn't clearly so politicized.
This is a question from Laura. In which archives did Judy do most of her research and find all those memoirs?
So some of these memoirs have been published, even in English, but they were published a long time ago by small presses or by museums, and they're not commercial reads. They're not like trade reading. So, but some of it was there. It was really any library would hold some of these translations. However, the archives that I used primarily, I used the Ghetto Fighters House in Israel, has a tremendous collection. They're mostly of the drawer, the freedom labor Zionists, but they have some other labor Zionists too, and even a few others. There's also an archive for the Hashomer Hatzair, the young guard labor Zionists, that's called Moreshet. And also very useful. There's, I use their resources quite a bit. And yeah, I use the museum in DC has an amazing archive. The Center for Jewish History has an archive. Polin, the museum in Poland, as well as the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. They're all listed in the book, in the bibliography at the end. I'm a historian by training, so it's all listed there. So you can actually see where I found a lot of these documents and a lot of the information.
Here's a question from Rick. Why did these courageous acts of Polish female resistance fighters not come to light earlier?
So this became a huge sub-question to all my research. On the one hand, what happened in the Jewish resistance? What happened to women? What was the story? And on the other hand, what happened to this story? How could I not have known it? And I talk about this much more in the book, and I don't want to get into it in too much detail now, but some of the reasons were political. There were political motivations for how the story of the Holocaust was told, especially in Israel and in Poland as well. Some of the reasons are zeitgeist, and we're interested at different times. We've been interested in learning and talking about different elements of the Holocaust. And we've also been afraid to talk about different elements of the Holocaust at different times culturally in the US too. And then some of it's personal. And some of it has to do with these women not telling their story. And many of them didn't tell their story or tried to tell their story, but they weren't believed. They were accused of sleeping their way to safety. They were accused of having been collaborators. They were accused of fleeing to fight instead of helping their parents. They had tremendous survivor's guilt. They felt that that compared to their peers who had been through Auschwitz, I mean, they hadn't had it that bad. They hadn't suffered enough. They almost felt like they didn't deserve to tell their story. And then some of it, I think, was coping. I'm writing about women who were like 22 when the war was over. They had their whole lives ahead of them. They had no family, no home, no country, no nationality. And they had to start over. And I think, like many refugees, they really felt they had to put the past behind them in order to move on and create a life. And also there were women, they felt very, almost like a cosmic duty to have children and to repopulate the Jewish people. And they wanted to create, happy, normal families. So I think for all these reasons, these stories got buried for a long time.
One of the things, and this is just a personal question, is, writing history and writing these stories, it takes a lot, right? It takes you have to translate, you have to, just writing is like an intense labor. And I feel like often it's like who has resources to fund, which stories are told, or who has resources to publish which stories. Like I often think, because I'm researching the Bunds, how few Bundist stories are, are told, because there wasn't like a Bundist state, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I thought was really cool was that you told the stories of people from all of the factions. I am very ignorant about the communist resistance, right? And you have a story of, communist fighters as well. And did you find that also, that tell me about the communist women, just a personal opinion, because that's what I don't know about.
So my mentions of the communist women, I have two examples in the book. I did this on purpose. I was trying to create a panoramic kind of view and to bring in a few women from these different movements, because I was also aware of how labor Zionist oriented my original source material was. Both the communist women that I speak about, I didn't find primary source material for them. They were both killed. So I'm writing about them by primary, I mean, I didn't find their own testimonies. So I'm writing about them often from secondhand other people who wrote about them at the time. Some of my material does come from these kind of remembrance essays or obituaries. But the two women were Mir Gola and Nusha Teitelbaum. And Nusha Teitelbaum was a communist. She was, she'd been born in Lodz. She had a history degree from the Warsaw University. She was very educated. And during the war, she braided her hair. She put in a kerchief. She pretended to be a 16-year-old Polish peasant girl. And she would use this disguise to make her way into Gestapo offices and homes and shoot them in the head. And then sort of, meekly walk back out of the room. And she earned the name Little Wanda with the braids. And she was on every Gestapo most wanted list.
My God.
Amazing. And then I also, I learned about her that because I'd read other accounts, that she taught women a lot of, in the Warsaw Ghetto, she had she taught women in particular how to shoot, how to use weapons. She kind of had her own little platoon where she trained women. So
I'm going to take another question. This is from an anonymous asker. What motivated these women to join the resistance? Were they driven by their Jewish faith?
So again, because I speak about many women, you know, there are different answers for different people, but for some of them, I think it came down Jewish. I don't know if it was faith, but pride. Again, back to the youth movements. They felt great pride in their heritage, in who they were, and this was so foundational to their adolescent training and learning. And I do think some of it, so someone like Frumka Plotnicka, she had been a leader in the youth movements before the war. She escaped to the East, like the same way my grandparents went, as the same way with most people from Dror, Freedom, the youth movement, but she couldn't take not being there. So a few weeks into war in 1939, she smuggled herself back into Nazi occupied Poland. She made her own way back to Warsaw. And, you know, became a leader in the Warsaw Ghetto, traveled the country, giving lectures and seminars, was the first woman to bring guns into the Warsaw Ghetto. She hid them in a sack of potatoes. It goes on, but I think about her because, I mean, she just felt a tremendous sense of responsibility to her people. That's what was written about in her. I found most information about her from essays that her extremely literate and smart friends had written about her after the war. But she felt, she was called Die Mame in the ghetto. She was a leader, and Die Mame is the mother. And she really felt that for her peers, for her Jewish community. She felt responsible. And again, I do think that was partially or mainly from this youth movement training.
Another question from Judith. You mentioned your own anxiety and wanting to know how these women came to act in espionage and violence. What did you learn about anxiety and fear from what these women endured?
I wish I could say I learned not to have fear and I have no more anxiety, but that's not true. What did I learn about it though? You know, I thought a lot about, besides the youth movements, you know, was there something similar to these women? Is there something about their personality? I went into this looking for Hannah Senish's personality. What is it about her? And so what's interesting is, of the women that did survive, many of them lived well into their 90s. And I've thought about that a lot too. Like, what is that? Why such longevity? Why? And I you know, I'm gonna tell you I think some of it has to do with, they had an incredible instinct. They were actors. They trusted their gut. They felt what was right or wrong in the moment, and they went with it. And I'm not like that. I'm a self-doubter. I'm always looking around. And you know, when I was interviewing Renya's children, the central character, like in passing, her son said something to me about how, you know, when she crossed the street, she wasn't someone who looked left and right and left and right. She just crossed the street. And that really stayed with me. You know, it was a nothing comment, but to me that meant everything. And I felt like I'm not someone who just crosses the street. I look left and right and left and right, left and right, and then left and right again. But I think many of these women just had that capacity to just act. They felt very confident and bold in their sense of the world and their place in it, and they went forward. I don't know if that answers the question, but
Here's another one from Anna Call. Where were most of the women fighters located, in the ghettos or in the forests? And how many would you say survived the war?
So my story, I focus more on the ghettos in this story, but I do have a chapter or two of women working in the forests, which is a whole other incredible, I mean, blowing up German trains and really being saboteurs in the forest. But in this story, I focused more on the ghettos. That's just where I sort of set the location of the story. As for how many survived, so since this book became public a few weeks ago, I think I get emails every single day with someone who emails me and says, Judy, my mother was in the resistance. She worked in the Warsaw Ghetto Hospital. I know she helped people get out. She never talked about it. Have you come across this name? My grandmother was killed on a bus. My we have a story of a great aunt who was smuggling weapons and she was shot when she went out of it. I mean, like every day I'm getting more stories. The book's published and I'm still getting more stories. So I don't know a number. We're still working this out. estimate is that there were thousands of women involved in organized underground work. Most were killed. Most Jews were killed. I mean, they were battling a massive military force set on killing them. Most Jews were killed, but a number of them did survive, and I'm learning more every day.
And in a certain sense, like, I don't think there can ever be an exact number because, as you said, 90% of the Jews in Poland were murdered, and the people who were doing this were specifically hiding all of their activities so that they wouldn't be killed.
I mean, the only time I heard about anyone keeping records was for some of these rescue organizations. They needed to know what money they were sending to which hiders in Warsaw. So they coded the names of the hiders. They coded the names of the people they were hiding. They coded the street names. They even put the wrong monetary amounts. They had a percent conversion, and the records were on piece of paper that they put under their watches. And you can see one of these in the Polin Museum in Warsaw. Like that's the record keeping of the time. When we're talking about, I mean, underground, really secretive operations, they didn't keep files. So yes, this is a constant issue for numbers. For that kind of data is very hard. Very hard to do.
Here's another question from Marcia. Do you have a sense of how much Jewish resistance and the greater partisan movement contributed to the ultimate defeat of the Nazis?
I mean, I don't know how to answer that. Again, I don't know, it's hard to talk numbers about this, but I think that, you know, many of the women, you know, there's some amazing stories in the book about women who are working in the East near Vilna, near Bialystok, who were doing espionage missions for the Red Army. They were helping, they were really helping them take down, they were doing intelligence work for them and helping them, you know, take down the Nazis in that area. So I do think in certain areas, these underground operatives, these Jewish women really did help and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I mean, it was not in the end a successful uprising. I mean, the Jews did not topple the Nazis, but they did put off the liquidation for some time. And they did, you know, and the rescue organizations did save lives. They did hide people. They did help people get out and find spaces to hide or get out of the country. So again, it's really hard to put numbers to this, but I do think it was part of the defeat, yes.
And I would also add that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was the first uprising, full stop, first urban uprising in Nazi-occupied Europe of anyone, Jewish or non-Jewish, yeah.
Yeah.
This is just a question for me. My name is Evelyn Goldberger Sassoon. I'm a second generation survivor, born and raised in Puerto Rico. Molly, if you don't mind me asking, why do you have a Puerto Rican flag in your background? Well, you know, Wepa, Evelyn, my father is Puerto Rican, my mother is Belarusian Jewish, and my dad is Puerto Rican. Okay, let's see. A question for Judy. This is from Lori Freeber. In your research, did you run across any young women who came from religious backgrounds and ended up as partisans?
I did, but these women usually left their religious backgrounds before joining the youth movements that they joined. So it was often a contention in their families that they left religion to join the socialist secular youth movements. So when I was writing about them, they weren't necessarily religious anymore. Some of the youth movements were more traditional. In Krakow, the main movement was Akiva, and they had Oneg Shabbat, and that was you know, big part of their ritual was Shabbat. And observing Shabbat. So you know, the youth movements were a little different too, but there was no one that I wrote about from a religious youth movement in that way.
This is from Linda Goldstein. If I'm correct, Poland has made it illegal for people to put blame on Poland for the Holocaust or collaboration. Can Judy comment on this?
Well, this is complicated, and I'll probably get it wrong because certain laws were made and then they were revoked and then things were changed. What I can say is that when I did research in Poland, I had Polish translators, drivers, fixers. I don't speak Polish, so I hired many young Polish people to help me. And they were so fascinated by this project. Like I hired someone to help drive me to this town of Beijing. She like showed up, she'd already done research on the whole Jewish community there and already had a list of addresses we should go to and things. I did not ask her for this or pay her for this. And to me, that was actually very moving that these young Poles that I was talking to, that I was meeting with, felt that this was important to them. This is part of their heritage too. And I actually really liked making that connection.
And one thing I also might add is that there's another, I think, untold story, probably it's a told story in Polish, but not in English, which is the story of Polish women in the resistance. One story that I always remember is there was a Polish courier named Mariska who she was at the Polish Socialist Party and very closely allied with the Bund, and she saved so many Jews from the ghetto by finding them hiding spots. And there's, I think, a whole other fascinating work to be written about the intersections between the young Polish women and the young Jewish women in the resistance.
Yeah, I have a couple of characters in my book. One woman, Irina Adamovich, she was a Catholic. She was in the resistance. Everyone knew her. She was the contact for the Jews, for the Polish resistance, she really organized and brought together many people. And yes, that's another book to write, Molly.
Okay, I have I think one more, there's so many amazing questions. So okay. Trying to find one last one. Let's see. My God, there's so many so many amazing comments. Okay, I'll ask this one as the last one. This is by Kristen Helen. Are these women recognized for their fights in today's Poland?
So that's a great question. And I never would have imagined this. So I wrote a piece for the New York Times a few weeks ago about my book, about some of these women, and it got picked up in Poland, and an article came out in Warsaw. And I talked in the New York Times piece about this woman, Nusha Teitelbaum, who had pretended little Wanda with the braids. And as part of the article in Poland, they were asking, why don't we know these stories? How come we don't know the stories of little Wanda with the braids? These people are incredible. And then they were saying, maybe we should start a movement to have monuments for little Wanda with the braids and for all these amazing Polish Jewish women. In Poland, there's a different political landscape there. So one of their answers was that she hasn't been talked about because she was a communist. And right now in Poland, people don't want to talk about or are not fond of the communist occupation that they felt over many decades. So again, this goes back to sort of how politics shape how we remember the Holocaust.
So I just want to thank you so much again for writing this book, Judy, and for speaking to us. And I also want to thank the Museum of Jewish Heritage for hosting this amazing talk. And I want to thank Ari. And I think it's just about 3 right now. So I think we're supposed to wrap it up around now. But everyone, buy The Light of Days, Judy Batalion's amazing book. And thank you so much for being here and for all of your insight and your questions and your time.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for having me and for your great conversation.
Ditto on the thanks. And I just have to say, we'll go 2 minutes over. First of all, there is a young readers edition. There was some questions about that. We put the link in the chat. Great for kids. There were a bunch of questions about this possible movie by Steven Spielberg. Judy, can we ask you to leave us wanting more?
So the book has been optioned by Steven Spielberg's Amblin company, and they've commissioned a screenplay, and I am one of the co-writers. And we'll see, we're working on it. It's still very early stages, but these stories are so dramatic and cinematic that we hope they'll make it to the screen.
Well, we hope so as well. Thank you both so much for your time. Molly, for taking us through this story, and Judy for sharing all of your insight and process with us. It was so inspiring. And thank you to all of you in the audience for joining us today. We will send out an email tomorrow with a recording and also some follow-up resources. So we're grateful to have you in our museum community. I should also mention that everything we do at the museum, including talks like this, is made possible through donor support. So thank you so much to those of you who added a donation when you registered today. And if you haven't and you're able, we ask you to please consider supporting our work at the museum, as well as joining us for our future programs. We have a program this Thursday evening with Helen Epstein about the experiences of children of Holocaust survivors. So, all right, we are a minute over, but thank you again. And I just want to wish everyone a great afternoon.
Thank you so much. Bye.